Hey everybody, my name is Gary Blackwood, aka GazzyB123. Thank you very much for watching our video today. I am coming at you on behalf of Upswing Poker. What we're going to do today is something a little different. We're going to be asking ourselves the 5 questions to ask yourself in every post-flop poker hand. So the flop comes down, you ask yourself these 5 questions. Each of these questions focuses on a crucial factor that shapes the optimal post-flop strategy. If you're a relative beginner, considering these factors will do big things for your win rate. Poker is all about understanding how your range interacts with the board and why you have a range advantage, or your opponent might have a range advantage in certain situations, depending on the position, the action, etc. So if you can start to master these 5 questions post-flop in a variety of situations, poker becomes very easy. Fairly experienced players will already be familiar with each of these, but if you're anything like me, you might need a refresher from time to time. So pretty awesome stuff we've got coming at you today. Going to talk a little bit about the tools that we're going to use. First and foremost, we're going to use Freed's upswing ranges, Freed's advanced cash solver ranges. They are available in the Upswing Lab, and they're absolutely fantastic. They give you a blow-by-blow account of how to play in each position versus each position. So the 2 ranges we're going to use, the situation we're going to be focusing on is button versus big blind. The range that you can see in front of you is the big blind's defense frequency. As we can see, everything that's green is going to be a call. Everything that's peach is going to be a 3-bet. And obviously we're mixing certain hands. So King Jack suited, we're going to 3-bet 75% of the time, call 25% of the time. 5-4 suited is going to be 50-50, and hands like Ace Deuce suited, and what else have we got in here? Queen 8 suited, King 6 suited, etc. We're going to 3-bet those 25% of the time, and we're going to call them the rest of the time. Looking at the buttons opening range, very standard opening range. Looks very good. So yeah, everything you can see here we're going to be opening. We're going to be using these 2 ranges. I have plugged these ranges into a very cool program called Poker Ranger. Very nifty tool that we're going to be showing you how to use today. And it allows you to calculate the equities that both players have on certain board textures. And it goes a little deeper than that. It shows you the relative strength of both players' ranges in terms of how strong the ranges are, and how well one range is going to be doing over another in terms of very strong hands, middling hands, what kind of draws you've got, etc. So we're going to use this tool and sort of show it off a little bit because we're very excited to have it. So without further ado, let's get straight into the action and let's get to question 1. Okay, straight into the action. Question 1, do I have the range advantage? For those of us not familiar with what that term actually means, it essentially means, is my range performing better than my opponent's range? Depending on the board texture. Now, you might say to yourself, well, it's really obvious, whoever is the pre-flop raiser is going to have the range advantage, and you would be forgiven for thinking that. However, that in general, that's not really the case. Well, for the most part, that's the case, but there are certain situations where the equities run really close, where they're almost identical, and there are also some situations where the pre-flop caller actually has an equity advantage. And this tool that we use is an absolutely fantastic way to display that. Now, for example, the first board that I've run, so I've input my button RFI, I've input my big blind defend versus button, and I've put the board of Ace Jack 6 rainbow. As we can see down here, it's a little small. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger. Perfect. So Ace Jack 6 rainbow, we calculate the equities. We wanted to change this ever so slightly to Ace Jack 5. Really simple tool that allows us to change the equity, very simple. Now, for a lot of the time, the pre-flop aggressor is going to have the equity advantage. Makes a lot of sense. And what I mean by equity advantage is the pre-flop aggressor's equity is going to be greater than his opponent's equity. There are some exceptions to that rule, as mentioned. For example, something like, if we get rid of this board texture and we do something like 7, 5, 3. Whereas we can see, perfect example, the buttons RFI, I mean, it's virtually identical. But if we look very closely at it, as we can see, the big blind actually has a little bit more equity. So in this specific example, there aren't too many textures where the button, where the big blind has more equity than the button. But certain situations in poker, for example, if the cutoff opens and the button flats, or if NP opens and the button flats, even if under the gun opens and the button flats, if under the gun opens and the big blind flats, there are not a lot of these situations within the game, but there are quite a few. And it's great for us to know what those situations are. And you might ask yourself, what do I do with this knowledge now that I know that the equities run really close? How does that affect my strategy? And it's really simple. On a board like 7-5-3, where the big blind has more equity, the big blind is supposed to lead a little bit, which is not something we see very often at all. And as well as that, more importantly, the button is supposed to do a lot of checking back. Whereas if we flick across to something like, let's do Ace of Diamonds, Ace of Hearts, Seven of Spades, calculate the equities, and as we can see, the button's equity is significantly higher on a board like this. One of the great things about this tool is that if we're poker players who are not familiar with the term equity, you might think that 55% doesn't sound like a lot more equity. But as you play around with the Poker Ranger, you'll see that there are not a lot of situations where we have more than 55% equity. I think the most we're going to have is around about 57, and for the most part, it hovers around about 53, 54%. So that's one way that we can use this tool to sort of indicate how we calculate who has the equity advantage. And as we use it and we practice with it, we'll see situations where we have a significant equity advantage, and we'll see other situations where we have a minimal equity advantage to the point where the big blind actually has more equity than we do. And again, really important, it's all well and good knowing how the equity advantage and disadvantage works, but it's really important that we use this to define our strategy. And what I mean by that essentially is if we don't have a lot of equity, we don't do a lot of c-betting, whereas on the flip side, if we have a ton of equity, let's do something like, I'm pretty sure a board like King 5, if we calculate the equities, I think around about 55 to 56% is what we're gonna peak at. And obviously, when we're at peak equity, i.e., we're on a board where we have significant equity and we know it, we c-bet really wide. One of the great parts about Poker Ranger is that it allows you to check the, just how well the equity runs throughout an equity distribution graph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, use the exact same ranges. We'll give the flop, let's do King of Hearts, Queen of Spades, Six of Clubs. And if we calculate the equities, as we can see, the button is going to have a significant equity advantage. And again, if we were to look at our pre-flop ranges, we would be able to work out why. Because the big blind is 3-betting a bunch of like Jack 10, Ace Jack, Ace 10, King Jack, King Queen, even some King 6, etc. At a very high frequency. And therefore, this is a better board for the button as opposed to for the big blind. So one of the great things that we can do with this tool, Poker Ranger, is we can click up here, the equity distribution graph. And again, if we evaluate the equities and we finish the evaluation, as we can see, the button's RFI is the button's range is doing significantly better over the course of the entire range. And what I essentially mean by that is that the button's nutted hands, the button's high strength hands, medium strength hands, and low strength hands are doing significantly better than the big blind's high, medium, and low strength hands. Now, you might think that that sounds quite obvious, but if we were to change back to something like 7-5-3 Rainbow, calculate the equities, as we'll see down here, the equities, such an easy tool to just calculate the equities very quickly between two ranges and how they're both performing on a certain flop. So if we evaluate again here, as we can see, completely different scenario. And it's great for us to see that, on a board like 7-5-3, if we're practicing how to play out the big blinds, it's a very different strategy compared to, our middling hands are performing very similarly to the button's middling hands, whereas on a board like King, Queen, 6 that we just looked at, the button's middling hands or weaker hands are performing significantly better. So really cool tool here, and we can actually break it down even further and look at certain hands. For example, on a board like 7-5-3, if we were to look at the big blind's defense, a hand like 7-6 suited has got 73% equity. Really cool to see that 7-6 clubs here has got 73% equity versus our opponent's range. So not only do we get to see just how the equities change depending on the distribution graph, but we get to see how specific hands throughout that graph are performing over the course of the entire range. So again, if we just pick a couple more random, let's do the buttons RFI, something like this, and like 10-6 suited, with 10-6 of clubs, with a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. Seems like a relatively strong hand, but it actually has 36.8% equity, which is not doing that well. So really awesome tool within Poker Ranger to show us, how well certain hands are doing throughout the course of the equity distribution graph. Let's move on to the second question. The second question you should ask yourself when you see a flop is, do I have a nutted advantage or does my opponent have the nutted advantage? Nutted advantage is a relatively new term within the poker world, and what it essentially means is, have I got more really, really strong hands than my opponent, or does my opponent have more really strong hands than I do on this board? Perfect example. I'm going to show you two examples within the Poker Ranger to sort of demonstrate, what nutted advantage is and how we can distinguish whether or not we have it or whether or not our opponent has it. It ties in nicely with equity advantage, but there are some times where the equity advantage is going to be better for one player, but the nutted advantage is relatively similar. Perfect example of that is that if the small blind three bets versus the cutoff, and the flop comes down Queen Jack 10, you might initially think that's a really good board for the small blind, but the ranges are actually relatively symmetrical in terms of the nutted advantage, in terms of queens, jacks, tens, ace king, king 9 suited, etc. Obviously, the cutoff is going to 4-bet those hands at a very small frequency, so the small blind does have a marginal nutted advantage, but then you factor in that the cutoff has got 9-8 suited, and then the nutted advantage again becomes very similar. So that's one very brief example of when the nutted advantage is relatively symmetrical, despite the small blind having a slight equity advantage on that board. A couple of really cool visuals for you within the Poker Ranger. So we're going to look at two different textures, and one of the great functions about the Poker Ranger software. So first things first, we're going to stick with our example, button versus big blind. Button is open, big blind is called. This flop texture we're looking at is ace, ace, king, a really specific example. And we'll calculate the equities. And as we can see, the button RFI is, his equity is 56.6. So initially we get to see just how much of an equity advantage the button has on a board like this. But one of the great things about Poker Ranger, and this sets it apart from some other poker programs that you might be familiar with, is that it gives you a really significant breakdown of the strong hands, of like 4 of a kind, full house, 3 of a kind, 2 pairs, straight draws, flush draws, etc., etc. So as we can see here, we've got the big blind's defense range and how it's performing, and we have the button's RFI and how it's performing as well. So as we can see, in terms of, we break it down into several categories of, very strong hands, mid hands, draws, combo draws, etc. And as we can see, the button has a significant, very strong hand advantage, and then mid hands, obviously, given the density of both ranges is relatively close, the big blind is going to outperform the button in some of these categories, and it's going to be with mid hands and draws, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we can break it down even further, and we can look at the specific number or the percentage of the range that makes up these hands. For example, the button RFI, the button has got more 4 of a kind, obviously, more full houses, because it goes without saying the big blind is going to 3-bet aces and ace king pre-flop. Therefore, the big blind can have no 4 of a kind, full houses, etc. But we can break it down even further into significant parts of both players' ranges. For example, the button has got 15%. 15.2%, we'll say, 3 of a kinds, compared to the big blind's 11.9%. In terms of 2 pairs, significant advantage. In terms of 1 pair hands, then again, obviously, the big blind needs to outperform the button in some aspect. So the big blind has got way more 1 pair hands, but the button is doing much better when it comes to the nutted advantage. On the flip side to the example we've just shown you is the a board like 6-4 deuce, really low. Again, button is open, big blind is defended. And if we calculate the equities, as we can see, the equities are very, very similar. In terms of nutted hands, the big blind is performing a lot better than it is on a board like ace, ace, king. And again, that's why the nutted advantage and the equity advantage, they kind of tie in with each other for the most part. So if we look at a board like this, 6-4 deuce, and we look at made hands, flop straights, and it is 0.83. It's a very, very small part of our range, but as we can see, the Poker Ranger tool helps us break it down and show us, the percentage of hands that we can have that make up our entire equity. So pretty cool to see that the nutted advantage is relatively similar on a board like this, whereas obviously on a board like Ace King, the button has a significant nutted advantage. So we can put in a whole different range of boards and look at the equity advantage, the nutted advantage, etc. And this Poker Ranger tool really helps us do that. Let's do one more real quick before we move on to the third question. If we do something like, let's do a pair board 10, 10, 5. We calculate the equity. And again, as we can see, a really significant equity advantage for the button. And we can break it down even further and look at the nutted advantage in terms of the button has a ton more, not a ton more, but a little more three of a kind, a little more two pair. And the big blind has a lot more one pair hands, so essentially not as strong a hand as obviously three of a kind or a full house or something like that. So pretty interesting to see just how Poker Ranger breaks it down for us even further. One of the great things about this tool is that we can actually hover over the different parts of what we're seeing here, and it breaks it down even further within the range. So our ranges are up here. If we hover over, let's do four of a kind, really obvious example, it shows us the four of a kind. If we were to do something like our two pair combos, it shows us within the breakdown of the ranges in the pop-up, the specific parts of a range that actually make two pair or three of a kind or a full house or something like that. So let's move on to the third question.
The third question you should ask yourself when you get to the flop is all about position. Firstly, am I in position? Am I out of position? And more so to do with how your strategy is defined based on whether or not you're in or out of position in that specific situation. Here we have in front of us a fantastic article from Boxing Poker in terms of positional play and how your strategy should be defined based on whether or not you're in or out of position. So to give a bit of context, for example, in a single raise pot, when we're out of position, we do a lot less c-betting. Given that the SPR is so small, for example, cutoff versus button or MP versus button, something like that, where, there are certain times where we're at a significant equity disadvantage. And we saw that a few seconds ago when we were talking about button versus big blind, etc. And it was kind of a rarity when we're in position. However, when we're out of position, it's relatively frequent that our opponent is going to have a significant range advantage or nutted advantage versus us, for example. Not necessarily a nutted advantage, in fact, but more so a range advantage. For example, MP and cutoff versus button. In a single raise pot, the particularly cutoff where the cutoff opening range is something like 29%, and the button's calling range is something like 5.8, 5.9%, something like that. The cutoff is going to miss so much that the button's really small range does a lot better on a lot of different textures, and therefore our strategy is defined by that, and we can use the Poker Ranger tool to see, in certain situations where we have a lot less equity than we normally do, and the definition of our strategy is very simple. When we don't have that much equity, we don't put as much money into the pot, i.e. we see bet less. On the flip side, as we've already seen, if we're in position and we've got a lot of equity, we're going to see bet really wide. So we've got to ask ourselves about position and the definition of our strategy when we're in position and when we're out of position. Question 4, we should ask ourselves, really important, what is the stack to pot ratio? Again, we have another fantastic article from Upswing Poker. I'm going to talk about it very briefly, but if you refer to the article on upswingpoker.com, an absolutely fantastic article that will break down, there are all different SPRs depending on the action. For example, 3-bet pot, we have a small SPR. 4-bet pot, we have a much smaller SPR. Single raise pot, we have a much wider SPR. So I refer you to the article on Upswing Poker, which is fantastic, and we'll break that down even further for you. So ask yourself, what is the stack to pot ratio? And what that essentially means is, say, for example, there is $100 in the pot and you have $100 behind. The SPR is 1. Really, really simple. And again, our strategy is defined by the SPR. There are so many different factors that define our strategy, and the SPR is one of them, and one of the most important ones. And it will, shape the size of the bets that we make. Now, this doesn't specifically apply to single raise pots where the SPR is very wide. A lot of the time, the SPR will be extremely wide in a single raise pot, particularly the deeper you play. But in 3-bet and 4-bet pots, sometimes on the flop, but mainly on the turn as well, you're going to ask yourself, what is the stack to pot ratio? And that will define a lot of the time the sizings that you choose, because you don't want to bet massively on the flop and leave yourself, a $100 pot with $30 behind. That's not going to make any sense. You would therefore elect to choose a slightly smaller flop c-bet size, which gives you a more appropriate stack to pot ratio on the turn. And obviously, you can bet the turn that will set you up for an SPR on the river. So the article on Upswing Poker is absolutely fantastic. Just ask yourself, what is the SPR and how is that going to change my strategy? Again, single raise pots, it doesn't really matter too much. But in 3-bet and 4-bet pots, we really want to shape our sizing structure so that we don't have a really small stack to pot ratio going to the turn and going to the river. The fifth and final question you should ask yourself is, am I heads up or am I multi-way? Obviously, you're going to know if you're heads up or multi-way when you look at the table and see who is still in the pot. But what we essentially mean is, how is my strategy different between when I'm heads up and when I'm multi-way? And, really, really important, particularly if we're playing low stakes or if we're playing live poker. If you're playing online 6-max, you go to the flop heads up a lot more often than you do multi-way. Whereas if you're playing, maybe low stakes online or just any live game, essentially, or full ring online, you're going to be going to the flop 3-handed, 4-handed, 5-handed a lot more frequently. And therefore, it's really important that we have a significantly different strategy for multi-way pots as we do for heads up pots. Now, really cool phrase I like to use is that there can only be 100% equity split amongst all the players in the pot. So obviously, if you're heads up, your range has more equity than it does if you're 3-handed or 4-handed or 5-handed or some live games 6, 7, 8-handed to the flop. So really important that we're thinking about how many players are in the pot and how that affects our strategy. Like I say, if you're heads up, let's discuss that first of all. If you're heads up to the flop, you can do a lot more betting. You can be a lot more aggressive. And again, the reason being is that because you're heads up, your range has more equity and therefore you're more willing to put money into the pots. Whereas if you're 3-handed or 4-handed or 5-handed, like I say, which happens really frequently in live poker, you have to be a lot more cautious when it comes to c-betting. For example, heads up, under the gun versus button, a board like 9-6 deuce, you can bet your overpairs a little more willingly. Whereas in that situation, if you're 3-handed or 4-handed, you need to be a lot more cautious, particularly on a board like 9-6 deuce, but also on a board like 8-7-3 flush draw, where there are going to be so many board changing turns where a lot of straights and flushes, etc., complete, and our opponent has more 2-pair combos, etc. You need to be thinking about that in terms of especially when, say for example, you open MP, button calls, and then the big blind calls. The big blind is going to be incentivized to call a lot wider now because the button is called as well, which means that his range is wider, and we need to factor in that he's going to have other combos that he normally wouldn't have. For example, say you open MP and the button doesn't call, the big blind is probably not going to defend 5 deuce suited, whereas if the button calls, he might elect to call that a little wider. So when the flop comes down 3, 4, 6, you need to be a little more mindful of some flop straight possibilities, etc. That is one very specific example, but we can obviously apply that with a lot more different textures of flops, etc. So coming back to what we were initially talking about, you've got to think about how many players are in the pot and how that defines your strategy. And the more players that are in the pot, the more, as the pre-flop aggressor, we want to pot control. We want to be checking really wide. One of the great things about that is it's kind of like a domino effect. When we start to check really wide, we need to have a really solid check raising strategy. So if we are playing a live game and we're the pre-flop aggressor and we're under the gun and the flop comes, say we've got pocket sevens and the flop comes down 9-7-3, instead of c-betting really wide, let's think about just how many other players are going to connect with that flop. And therefore we want to play a balanced strategy and we want to do a lot of checking. We can put pocket sevens into our checking range and then we just always check raise it. So instead of c-betting it, always we think about it, we don't want to c-bet a lot on this board with our range. Therefore our really strong hands, we put them into our checking range. And we need to have a really strong check raising strategy. So it's really important that we don't just play the same, whether we have one opponent or 3 opponents in the pot. We need to define our multi-way strategy because obviously a lot of us are playing live, low stakes online, etc., where you go to the flop 3 or 4-handed a lot more. And it's really cool that we can start to check a lot more. Our betting range is defined. And like I say, when we do a lot of checking, we do a lot of check raising as well with our strong hands and our strong draws as well. So really cool to work out, what hands we want to check raise with and what hands we want to check call with, etc. So those are the 5 questions that we always ask ourselves when going to the flop. All right, guys, thank you very much for joining. These have been the 5 questions you should ask yourself when you reach the flop. On behalf of Upswing Poker, I have been Gary Blackwood. Hopefully you've enjoyed the content. Just want to quickly talk about some of the tools that we've used to create this video. Obviously, you've got the articles available on upswingpoker.com. You should check those out as soon as possible. As well as that, we've also got this really awesome tool called Poker Ranger that we were demonstrating. just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the features that it comes with that we were able to demonstrate in this video. Available on a 21-day free trial, which is really awesome. So I'd recommend you grab that as soon as possible. Play around with it. Really awesome for calculating equities, comparing ranges, high ranges, interact with each board, depending on the texture, etc. A bunch of other really cool features that are explained on the website. So definitely check it out. So yeah, big thank you for joining. On behalf of Upswing Poker, I have been GazzyB. Thank you.